to episode 31 of the Trainer's Bullpen, Motor Learning Feedback with Dr. Tim Lee. The type of feedback that a trainer or coach gives their students, and the manner in which that feedback is provided, is of critical importance to the effectiveness of how well motor skills are acquired, retained, and transferred. The most common type of feedback that is often applied in law enforcement motor skill environments is described as quick and corrective. That is, the trainer views the mistakes and errors as enemies and therefore is very quick to step in and provide feedback when the student is struggling. In addition, the feedback that is usually provided is highly corrective. That is, what you were doing wrong, what you need to do to correct it, now do that. Ironically, while very prevalent, this type of feedback has been demonstrated to result in the worst retention and transfer of movement skills to the real world. In this interview, motor learning expert, researcher, accomplished author, and coach for the Titleist Performance Institute, Dr. Tim Lee, discusses the impact of feedback and the methods of feedback that trainers should consider in order to optimize the learning potential of their students. In this interview, we discuss the different types of feedback, inherent and augmented, using knowledge of results rather than knowledge of performance, the importance of student motivation, and how feedback can either bolster or impair student motivation, the relationship between feedback types and the student's focus of attention, the danger of creating students who are feedback dependent and how to avoid this from happening, the use of video as a feedback tool, the timing of feedback, hint, delayed feedback is usually optimal, and bandwidth feedback, what it is and how to apply it to really maximize your feedback potential for motor learning. Have your pen and paper ready because this interview contains very important information to help you advance your tradecraft as a trainer. Welcome to the Trainer's Bullpen, where trainers in the law enforcement space come to hear the experts talk about their work, experience, and research into human performance, particularly as it relates to the critical aspects of training motor learning and adaptive decision-making. The purpose of the Trainer's Bullpen is to help bridge the gap between law enforcement training and the findings of academic research and current pedagogical best practice. Our desire at the Trainer's Bullpen is to help advance law enforcement training to make research applied and improve officer and public safety. The Trainer's Bullpen is a production of Raptor Protection, and I'm Chris Butler, your host. And today it's my pleasure to welcome back to the Bullpen Dr. Tim Lee. Dr. Lee is a professor emeritus at McMaster University's Department of Kinesiology in Hamilton, Ontario, Canada. His research concerns motor learning, how individuals acquire and transfer motor skills from training environments to places of work and play. He has published more than 140 research investigations in peer-reviewed psychology and kinesiology journals, and he is the author of the book Motor Control in Everyday Actions and co-author of the books Motor Learning and Performance and Motor Control and Learning, both soon to be released in their 7th editions. In 2012, Tim was inducted as an honorary director of the PGA of Canada and also serves as a technical advisory board member and golf coaching certification instructor for the Titleist Performance Institute. In addition, Tim consults frequently for the Force Science Institute in Mankato, Minnesota, and has delivered a keynote address at their 2022 conference. Tim has been a lifelong competitive athlete in a number of sports and still competes regularly in senior amateur golf competitions in Canada and the U.S. Tim lives in Ancaster, Ontario, nearby a blended family that includes 9 grandchildren. Welcome, Tim, to the Trainer's Bullpen, and thanks again for making the time.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. So, Tim, you're going to soon be having an updated edition of your textbook, Motor Learning and Performance, coming out soon, and we're very excited about this. And during our methods of instruction courses that we deliver around North America, we've been chatting this up, and we've been using actually your Motor Learning and Performance previous edition as foundational for so many of the aspects that we talk about during the methods of instruction course. And it's just been very helpful for us to help law enforcement trainers understand all the critical issues of coaching and motor skill acquisition. But what I'm super excited about, when I heard probably close to, I don't know, Tim, was it maybe 8 months or 9 months ago where we had a conversation and you said, in my updated edition, I'm going to have a chapter on feedback. And this got me very excited because, I think when we consider the important relationship between the types of feedback, the methods of feedback that law enforcement trainers give, I think it's fair to say the predominant type of feedback that we typically see in most academy and in-service training is the highly extrinsic type of feedback where a trainer will see their student doing something that they feel is incorrect or inefficient. They'll quickly step in and tell the student what they're doing wrong and what they need to do to correct it. And then they'll step back and watch the student just mimic or repeat what it is they've been asked or demonstrated to do. And of course, all with perfectly good intention, right? We think we're being very helpful when we provide that type of feedback. But what I've come to understand from you, Dr. Lee, is that actually that doesn't lead to optimal retention and transfer of motor skills. And, as I reflected on that, I thought of the study that Doctors John and Don O'Neill did of 3 major police academies where they looked at the retention and perishability of motor skills after recruits had graduated the academy. And in their study, they found that 6 weeks following training, that all of those motor skills, simple and complex motor skills, had deteriorated to practically non-operational. And one of the reasons the O'Neill said was because of the type of feedback that they observed that trainers gave was of that highly extrinsic type of feedback. So we're super excited about this interview. And, I'm just wondering maybe where's the best place to start this conversation, Tim? Maybe, well, you know what I'd be interested to know, why is it that you felt it was important to dedicate an entire chapter in your upcoming textbook to feedback itself?
Well, first of all, let me just backtrack just a bit. You say that that this has been an issue with instructors in law enforcement. I think that it's broader than that, Chris. I think it's been an issue with instructors in education, in sports coaching, instruction, and in many different walks of life and professions where the use of feedback has been really not scrutinized very carefully, and what we're finding has been probably misused in many ways over the years. So I wouldn't want to single out law enforcement as being only the only group that's been affected here. I think it's been across the board.
Yeah, great.
So,
fair comment.
Yeah, but it's what we're finding out is that feedback has a very nuanced role in learning, and some of the things that we thought were kind of a given about the role of feedback in learning has been kind of turned a little bit on its head, and in some ways turned upside down, which I'm sure we'll get to over the next hour.
Right, absolutely. And in your chapter that you shared with me that'll be published in your upcoming 7th edition, as I reviewed that, you spoke about different classifications or types of feedback. Tim, you want to start there, and maybe we can start with those 2 broad categories and how we understand that?
Yeah, I think that's a great place to start because feedback has been used in a number of different ways. And if you think about it, the term comes from fields like engineering, where a simple case of a home heating system is critically important for the use of feedback. Right? This closed loop system where you have a furnace and a thermostat. Thermostat samples the air and sends information to the furnace to either turn on or turn off, which results in a change in the temperature. And this is a feedback loop that regulates the system on an ongoing basis. Well, the idea in human motor control and human action is very similar in that we have ways of getting information that help us regulate what we do and make changes to what we're doing. The two different common uses of the term feedback are information that we receive from our senses, and that's been termed inherent or intrinsic feedback. And that's information that we get from our eyes, or through our eyes, visual information, through our ears, auditory information, haptic feedback that we get from touch sensors on our fingertips and our skin, kinesthetic and proprioceptive feedback that we receive from the muscles and joints as we move. That's all intrinsic or inherent information that we're getting directly from our senses. The other type of information, and this is kind of the what I generally refer to as feedback, or what we'll be talking about from now on, is what we refer to as augmented feedback. So, and it's also, some people call it extrinsic feedback, but it's information that comes from an external source. Now, we still receive it through our senses, but we don't receive it generally in a direct way. We receive the information from an external source like a coach or an instructor. And that can be information in the form of like a video display. We may not be aware of it directly, but by means of taking a video, we can see, for example, what we're doing. We're not directly able to see what we're doing ourselves, but through the use of visual feedback through a video, we're able to see ourselves move. You can also provide augmented feedback auditorily. You can provide augmented feedback in a number of different ways, haptically, but visual and feedback is the most common types of augmented direct source of information about what we're doing. And I should add to that verbal feedback as well in the form of knowledge performance, which we'll get into.
Sure. All right. So just for our trainers listening then, if, the type of feedback, if we're looking at our students performing some type of a motor skill, let's say it's ground fighting or something like that, and the trainer then sees that there's more optimal ways that the student could have moved to solve the problem, the verbal feedback that they would step in and provide, that would be under this category of augmented feedback then, is that correct?
That's right. That's right. It's usually information that the individual is not directly aware of. And the source of the augmented feedback could be different variations of sources, but it's usually something that they're not getting directly from their senses, and it's being supplied to the information that we get from our senses.
Okay, great. That makes perfect sense. So you spoke in your chapter about subcategories, I guess. Well, you didn't call them that, but they seem to me to be almost subcategories of augmented feedback with respect to the time that feedback can be given. And so that was before movement, during movement, and after movement. Do you want to talk to us about those three and what are they? And is there an optimal one, or how does that all work?
Yeah, well, it really depends on, a lot of that has to do with the nature of the task. So we get augmented information prior to movement, for example, through modeled demonstrations and through instructions. If you are working with a new student and you're telling them the correct way of doing things, then you're kind of giving a step-by-step verbal instruction of what to do. If you model an action, let's say, you strike like this, don't strike like that. That's showing it visually. Again, it's information that's telling a person what to do, and it usually occurs early in the learning sequence. information that is being augmented information or feedback that's being provided during the movement, that usually refers to movement tasks that are continuous in nature, like long, ongoing movement. For example, if I'm driving a car, for example, you might get lane departure auditory feedback. If you're crossing the line, the car will beep at you and say, get back in the lane. Or, modern cars now have haptic feedback where the steering wheel will vibrate to tell you that you've crossed the line. Or it may actually force the steering wheel back towards the line. It'll bump it back towards the middle of the lane. Those are types of augmented sources of feedback that are ongoing during the movement itself. And lastly is feedback that's after the movement. And that's typically given for tasks or movements of very short duration, where it wouldn't be practical to provide the information during the movement because the movement is over with so quickly. So it's information that's given after the movement. And that's where feedback sources like knowledge of results and knowledge of performance come in, where they tell you something about the success of the movement or the movement itself after the movement is completed. So those three timings, before, during, and after, really kind of categorize the types of delivery and timing of feedback, augmented feedback.
Okay, perfect. So would an example of before movement be like if you're using an exemplar to demonstrate a technique, or using a video, if you have a video of a full technique and you had your performers observe that exemplar or that video, would that be an example of before movement feedback?
Exactly. That's kind of, and strictly, it doesn't fit the strict definition of the term feedback itself because it's not something about what you've done. But in fact, it is information about something you're about to do. And if you think about feedback as information that helps to change or alter what you're doing or what you will do, then it certainly fits that category quite well.
Okay. And would like constraining or restraining devices that control movement be an example of during movement feedback? I'm thinking, sometimes what I'll do in training is I'll put a restriction band on one of my students that will really limit or impair the movement of one of their arms or the other, so that they have to now find different movement solutions. Would that fit in that category of during movement feedback?
Absolutely, because they're getting augmented feedback from trying to move beyond the restriction that you're imposing on them. And the feedback that they're getting is artificial in a way because you're restricting it, even though they're getting it through the senses. It's still an artificial form of feedback, and it's augmented to what they would normally receive in a situation where that restriction wasn't there. So
Okay,
it certainly fits
great.
that definition. Absolutely.
All right. Okay. And then with these three types of feedback, Tim, the before, the during, and the after movement feedback, does the research tell us that, if there's low hanging fruit as far as which one is most effective? Is there one, or are they all effective if used in a proper way, or how do we understand that?
I think that it really depends on how they're used. They can be very effective if used appropriately. They can be very ineffective if used inappropriately. And that physical guidance example you just gave, when it's used to help inform the learner about something they would otherwise not be able to learn or not be able to understand, then it's a very useful form of guidance device, can be a very useful format. However, if it's used such that the person makes repetitive movements over and over and over and over and over again with the idea that constricting their movement allows them to groove in some sort of or stamp in some sort of memory, then we're falling into a trap where in fact you're actually undermining learning. And there's a lot of reasons why the learner is worse off in that situation than if they were given no restrictions at all. So
Okay, well,
it really depends on how you apply it.
okay. So you know what? You just kind of opened an important can there. Um, can you expand on that a little bit? Like,
Sure.
as we understand motor learning, what would be ways in which that could be used in a way that would impair learning rather than enhance it?
I'll give you a practical example. I was playing golf one time, and as you know, I'm a big golf fan and golfer myself, and I was at the LPGA instructional facility in Daytona, Florida, and I was watching this young lady practice, and she was on the putting green, and she was with an instructor, probably a coach. Um, she was making 4-foot putts to a hole. She had her head rested against a platform so it wouldn't move. There was a chalk line on the putting green that through which she was to try to follow or direct her putt. There were 2 tees situated on the green where the putter head could only just barely go through to try to constrain the path. And what she did is she stroked putt after putt after putt into the hole. And I watched her for about 20 minutes. She never missed a putt in that 20 minutes. And the coach kept taking the balls out of the hole and bringing them back and putting them in front of the putter. So she never moved an inch the whole 20 minutes. And I thought to myself, my goodness, that's 20 minutes of absolute wasted practice time right there. Because you think about how different that is from actually making a putt out on the golf course, where you only get one chance at doing it, where you've got none of these constraints or artificial aids that are there to help you. And it just falls into that trap that if we can groove an errorless performance, then we're going to maximize learning from that situation. And I think it really, to me, undermines the whole concept that people have that errors are things that we need to get rid of as quickly as possible, where in fact, I think we should embrace errors, learn from errors, and figure out how errors contribute to our performance and how we make them and why we make them and how we can avoid them in the future. And putting ourselves or putting someone in a situation where they physically cannot make an error, I think is probably the worst possible thing you can do, especially when you do it over and over and over again. What you were talking about earlier, though, was helping a person gain an understanding of what it is you're trying to get them to understand through a physically restricted environment. That's fine. That's fine. As long as you don't fall into the trap of thinking now we have to groove that movement or that skill into memory without any possibility of making an errorful performance. Hope
Right.
that
And
makes some sense.
yeah, no, I think it really is helpful, Tim. And as I think about, that we often talk about in our MOI courses, the difference between a linear and nonlinear world of performance, and police officers perform in arguably perhaps the most ambiguous, dynamic, rapidly unfolding, and nonlinear world possible. So I think your point then is if we have such a linear, restrictive, and this whole idea of perfect practice makes perfect, I can't tell you how many times I've heard that in law enforcement training, and full confession, I've said it myself early on because it just sounded cool. So, but really, that's sort of a dangerous methodology when you're trying to prepare performers for great adaptive performance in a nonlinear world, isn't it?
Absolutely. There's a saying which I think is completely wrong, that if you make errors, then you learn to make errors. And I That's just turning what you just said around the opposite way. Nothing could be further from the truth, I think. You make errors and you learn from errors and you learn to know how to not make them in the future.
Right, absolutely. So that's so with the after movement feedback now. So your chapter discusses two important considerations within that category, and you already briefly introduced those. That was knowledge of results and knowledge of performance. So that's important. Let's start with that knowledge of results. Can you tell us what that means?
Well, the two terms simply refer to what information is being fed back to the learner. Knowledge of results refers to information that's being fed back about the success of the action or the success of the movement in terms of what they were trying to accomplish. So if you're trying to, for example, if you're at a shooting range and you're trying to hit a bullseye, knowledge of results is information about the success of those shots relative to the bullseye. Knowledge of results, on the other hand, knowledge of performance, on the other hand, refers to information about something about the action itself, either something about the movement, for example, the movement path or the regulation of the movement, or something about the kinetics or kinematics of the movement, the forces or the timing of the movement. So knowledge results refers to the outcome, knowledge performance refers to the movement itself.
Okay, so let me give you an example, and you tell me if I've got this right. I'm teaching officers how to draw their handgun out of their holster, and so if I use feedback or set up the movement in such a way that I have them think about the position of their elbow, the position of their wrist on the gun, the movement of the arm as the gun comes out, that would be knowledge of performance. Is that correct? Rather than having them think about the end result of getting their gun out of the holster and their muzzle on target?
That's correct. Yeah.
Okay.
And if you were to provide them some information about the time it took to acquire the target, meaning get the pistol accurately pointed at the target, that time might be a measure of knowledge of results.
Okay, right. Oh, perfect. And because we do that all the time, actually. Like if we were to say you have 2 seconds to draw your handgun and fire your first round onto the target, that would be a pretty clear measure of knowledge of results then.
Exactly.
Okay. Now, Tim, one of the things that you stated is you said this: a key principle for motor learning is that some information relative to goal achievement must be received either through inherent sources or augmented sources for learning to occur. So, do you care to add on to that or to comment about that statement?
Sure. You're really, in order to make improvements, you need to know if you're making if you are in error or not. And the only way that you can understand if you're making mistakes or errors is through direct perception, intrinsic inherent feedback, information that you get, or through augmented information. For example, if you're shooting at a target that is 5 meters away, then you can probably see the results of your shots. If you're shooting at a target that's 100 meters away, you need augmented information to see the results of your shots. Either way, you need something about the information. Let's just give you an example. Suppose the sights are off, and even though you're a very good marksman, your shots are drifting to the upper left-hand quarter simply because the sightings on your gun weapon are off. You would know that unless you could see the results of your shots in the 5-meter example, or if you got augmented feedback from another source in the 100-meter example. Either way, you wouldn't know how to change, or you wouldn't even know that you needed to change unless you got that information fed back to you. And just take that example now and take it into a learning situation where you're trying to make permanent improvements. Again, you need to get that information from an inherent source, but if that's not appropriate or not available to you, then you need augmented feedback.
Okay. And while you're on the topic of errors, because one of the things that, I kind of struggle to understand, especially in combatives like physical combat skills, is if an officer is able to, let's say, we'll just use a ground fight, for example, they got somebody who's on top of them in a mount position, and the objective is to defeat that mount position to get out and get into a position of control. If they're able to perform it, so let's say that they have a movement solution that they're able to achieve the desired outcome, but as a trainer, I stand back and I go, yeah, you did it, but it was kind of ugly, right? In my mind, I'm thinking there's much more efficient ways that you could have used ballistics and power and movement to accomplish that. How is that an error then? Or like, how do I, because there's things that are definitely errors, right? No, it's just that didn't work.
Right.
It didn't solve the problem. You didn't meet the objective. So I understand that. That's clear. But what about the ones where they accomplished the objective, but I still want to provide some meaningful feedback for them to improve their performance? Would we call that an error as well?
Well, no, I don't think so. I guess what you're getting at, I think, Chris, is something about the what is the important information in that situation in order to make improvements. And you can tell a person, for example, that they were wrong. And if they have no idea whatsoever in terms of why they were wrong, then that augmented information is probably going to be ineffective or relatively ineffective. So it really depends on the learner's, some of it has to do with the learner's skill level. The more that they are skilled, the more that they are able to take in information from you and fit it into their own schema and figure out solutions that will work next time. Okay. I think the beginner probably needs more explicit types of information about exactly what they're doing wrong than a more skilled individual. A more skilled individual can probably take in more nuanced information, more high level information, if you will, because that lower level information is probably something they're already attuned to, and they need something that's a little bit more of a specific nature.
Okay. Oh, that's super helpful. So knowledge of results and knowledge of performance then. So knowledge of results is the feedback that's provided based on the outcome of the performance, the goal,
Mm-hmm.
And then knowledge of performance, as you described it, more on the kinematics, the movement, and that type of aspect. So when you look at, go ahead, Tim. You wanted to.
I was just going to give you a different example. You think of a figure skater who goes out and does a routine and gets a score from a judge. Well, an unskilled figure skater may have no idea why they got a poor score. Whereas then the score is just the score. It tells them nothing at all about the quality or the nature of the routine, or perhaps some of the faults that they made. But the more highly skilled the figure skater, the more they can take that simple information and extract probably the reasons for it.
Okay, so I have a follow. I love your commentary because it always gets me asking more questions. Is it also helpful when you have a performer that is doing well, like they've done a movement solution and it's been a good one? I think the error that I make sometimes is I assume that they know why they perform so well, because I fall into this category of, well, when it's not good, that's clear. I need to provide feedback, but I think the wrong assumption I can make is when I see somebody doing something that is excellent, making the assumption they know precisely how they moved and what they did was effective. And could that be an error on my part as a coach or a trainer? And should feedback also be provided when there's great performance to reinforce, to make sure our learners know what it is that they did well and reinforce those principles?
Okay, I'm gonna answer that question in a slightly different way. What I'd like to, and I was hoping we would get into this sooner or later, so I'm going to use this opportunity to get into it now.
Go
And
for it.
that is, Chris, instead of telling the person something, why not ask the person? So if they think they did something good, ask them, what do you think you did well there? Or what do you think, or if they did something wrong, ask them, what do you think you did incorrectly there? Okay. And there are several reasons for that. First of all, and I know we're going to get into this a little bit later, but I think and not to be critical of coaches and instructors, because I know that they're doing their darndest to do the best job they can, but
Right.
sometimes I think you can overcoach or over instruct. And by that, I mean, sometimes you jump in too quickly, or not you, but people, instructors, coaches jump in too quickly with feedback. And there's several things that result from that. One thing is that it kind of prevents the learner from problem solving it themselves. If they did something wrong, give them a chance to try and figure it out. What I mean by that is that if they did something wrong, they need to be able to have that skill to figure it out in the field. So why not give them that opportunity in training as well? Okay, have them do that problem-solving process during the training itself, so that when they're out in the field, they're familiar with how to problem solve. Okay, now and there's a couple advantages to doing that. So rather than jumping in and giving them the answer, either why they're doing it well or why they did it poorly, ask them, tell me what you think just happened. Tell me why it was good. Tell me why it was bad. This gets them to do the problem-solving process, and it also makes their answer much more salient when you actually give them the feedback. So if they're right, it's a pat on the back. That's correct. You understood why you did this correctly. You understood why you did this incorrectly. That's positive motivational feedback, which is good. But if they're wrong, the answer that you give them is now going to have much more impact because they have already tried to figure it out. Okay? So having gone through that problem-solving process, or at least attempted to come up with the solution to why they did it well or why they did it poorly, they've come up with an hypothesis, and now you're going to either pat them on the back for being right, or you're going to correct them, and in either case, their attempt to solve it is now going to be much more salient to them, so that your feedback now has that much more impact.
Awesome. That's super helpful. Thank you for that. So, when it comes to knowledge of results or knowledge of performance, Tim, is one better than the other? Does it depend on skill level? Does it depend on the movement? That's like, how do we understand those two categories?
Yeah, it really depends on. I think early on in the research, people thought that knowledge of performance was the be all to end all. That it was going to be the once we gained once we got cell phones and could provide immediate video feedback and things like that, it would solve all of our problems. And we've come to realize, in fact, that it really depends on a lot of different factors. For example, if you show a complex video to a beginner, there is so much information going on that they have no idea what to look at, what to look for, and the information is just overwhelming. Yet you show that same video feedback to a very knowledgeable, skilled law enforcement officer, and they will look at it and go, aha, they can dissect it right away. Okay, so knowledge of performance can be overwhelming to the unskilled without a coach that's there to help point out certain things to look for. Don't look at this, look at this, for example. So sometimes knowledge of performance can be too much. On the other hand, sometimes knowledge of results can be just the right amount of information. For example, Rob Gray did a wonderful study a number of years ago trying to get people to increase, this is the baseball study, and they're trying to get hitters to increase the angle of attack, the height of the ball as it left the bat. And he simply had a rope that they tried to hit it over, during somewhere out in the infield, and the ball either went over the rope or under the rope, and it was just simply knowledge results feedback that they got, and it was great because that information could be used to problem solve it in many different ways. It was just enough information that they gave them different ideas about what if I did this? What if I did that? Rather than providing with solutions, it provided them with enough information, but not too much information to let them problem solve it on their own. So I guess what I'm saying is that it really depends on the situation. Sometimes just a little information like knowledge results can go a long ways, and sometimes too much information from knowledge performance can be too overwhelming. So it really depends on a number of factors.
Okay. And you mentioned that there's 4 things that augmented feedback can contribute to. And it seemed to me as I read through that chapter that some of those things that it can contribute to can really enhance learning. And then there were others that can impair it. And so maybe we can talk about what those 4 things were. And I'll just say for our audience what they were. They can motivate or discourage the learner. They can direct the learner's focus of attention. They can provide information about errors that need to be corrected. And they can create a dependency on feedback that can impair later performance. So let's talk about those 4, Tim. Let's start with motivation. In what ways does augmented feedback impact student motivation?
Well, augmented feedback can affect motivation in a couple ways. One is kind of an indirect way. That is, if you're saying, great, good job, keep it up, that kind of a motivational influence has an impact of encouraging the person to keep practicing. You're doing well, you're getting there, keep at it. Those types of motivational comments are things that keep the person practicing, and the practice is what contributes to the learning. So it's indirect in that it motivates the person to keep practicing, and it's the practice that improves the learning. So that's the indirect way. The direct way is a little bit more nuanced. It comes from some relatively recent research in the last decade, last 15 years, in which researchers have looked at the impact of telling a person how well they're doing. For example, they would have compared 2 groups of individuals. One that would be told, in your last 10 tries, these were your 5 worst shots or your 5 worst attempts. And another group that said, in your last 10, these were your 5 best. And it seems as though results were that the ones that were shown the best results were the ones that improved the most. which seem to have this influence of positive feedback, seem to have a direct beneficial effect on learning. A related type of experiment is where they would say, well, here's your results, and your results are better than 75% of the people who've done the same study, or your results are worse than 75%, or you're in the lowest 25%, 25th percentile of people who've done the study. This again contrasting high versus low positive feedback. And again, the ones that were given this positive feedback, even though it had nothing to do with how they actually performed, it was just bogus feedback. The ones that were told they were doing great, again, learned much better than the ones that were told that they were doing poorly. So it does seem to have a direct and indirect effect on learning.
Okay. So I'm interested in your opinion on this then, because sometimes we'll hear trainers, if they're using that negative type of feedback, so focusing on negative performance or potentially negative outcomes. For example, if an officer is doing building clearing where they think there's a armed offender in the building and they're practicing that, and say they're not using cover effectively or something, a trainer might say something like, use the term like, you got caught in the fatal funnel, and if that happens in the real world, you're going to get, you're likely to get killed if you do that in the real world. And
Right.
what I'm concerned about is that type of feedback can cause our performer to catastrophize potential outcomes rather than having some kind of positive feedback that can motivate them to improve. Is there research on that type of thing, or what's your experience tell you?
I don't know about that kind of example in particular, Chris, but I think what you could do, there are ways of turning that scenario around. And what I mean by that is, say, rather than saying this could get you killed, would there be a way of saying, how could you do that differently in order to produce a successful outcome? And if the person could problem solve it, then you could give positive feedback about that ability to problem solve, even though in the end it's a feedback about what they had done improperly. But you could turn it around so that eventually they're getting positive feedback about how they problem solve, what they would do differently.
Okay. No, that's very helpful. Thanks. So, yeah, and I mean, student motivation is super important for learning, isn't it? I mean, it probably goes without saying that most of us understand that our people need to be very motivated to learn well. And I'm sure there's got to be research that shows us that if our students are unmotivated or demotivated, they don't learn nearly to the level that highly motivated students do. So,
Absolutely.
yeah. So
Absolutely.
would you say that is there an onus then or responsibility on the coach or the trainer to find ways to really connect with and motivate our learners?
Yeah, I think so. I guess one of the things that uh, there are different ways of motivating. I think that, and this is getting a little bit beyond my realm of expertise, but things like goal setting, where you're trying to establish. It's like goal setting is like an agenda, if you will. You for an agenda for a meeting, you set up steps on where you want to get to by the end of the meeting, and goal setting is a way of helping a person motivate with small steps along the way to get to a final endpoint. So, and I think, again, it's not my area of expertise, but I think there are different ways of creating situations that help motivate, and then fitting feedback into that step-by-step process to try and reinforce the motivating aspects of what you're trying to achieve.
Okay. No, that's helpful. So that's motivation was number one. Number two was focus of attention. That augmented feedback can impact a learner's focus of attention. And as I understand it, there's a lot of research that's been done on focus of attention and motor skill acquisition and motor learning. And it seems to me that it's for police officers, it's quite important for them to be able to maintain an external focus of attention in that ambiguous high consequence environment that they perform in the real world. So can you tell us in what ways does augmented feedback impact a performer's focus of attention?
Well, if you think about what we go back to our definitions of knowledge performance and knowledge results. Knowledge results is about let's focus on knowledge performance. Knowledge performance is about information about the movement itself. And that is very similar to an internal focus of attention. An internal focus of attention is focusing on the production of the movement. So it just kind of sets up a conundrum in training where you're trying to get people, you tell people that a external focus of attention is very important for skilled execution of the movement. Don't think about what you're doing, think about what you're trying to achieve. And yet in training, you're giving them knowledge performance about the movement itself, which forces them to think inwardly. That's a bit of a conundrum because you're trying to get them to think externally, and that you're providing knowledge performance which gets them to think internally. So I think it's important to kind of break up training into stages or steps where you're thinking about the movement or thinking about making changes to the movement, and then doing practice or training exercises where you're trying to block that thinking out and think about the external consequences of the movement. I don't think we as researchers have done a good job that I know of yet in parsing how to do that. And that's why I say it's a bit of a conundrum, how to train providing knowledge performance, yet still encouraging an external focus of attention. And I think that that's a good area for study that I hope we see some improvements in terms of making qualitative advice to practitioners how to go about using those two sources of information.
Right. Okay. But if I understand you correctly, Tim, as a general principle, though, trainers should, as much as they can, try to align the training environment and the criterion environment so that if I know my officer out on the street is going to need to be primarily in a 100% external focus of attention during the performance, as much as I can, I want to create a learning environment where my feedback, the way I set up, the way I communicate with my people, also encourages an external focus of attention. Would that at least be a general principle?
That's a general principle, but sometimes you still have to provide knowledge of performance, which gets them thinking internally. So you still have to, in that training, still have to make that dissociation between the two. It reminds me of a book by Lynn Marriott and Pia Nielsen, two instructors, golf instructors in Arizona, and they talk about they break the sequence of hitting a golf shot into the think box and the play box. And the think box is where they stand behind and visualize the shot and think internally. But once they step into the shot, get ready to hit the shot, all those thoughts go out the window and they think nothing but external focus, which is okay for a closed skill like golf where you have time to prepare and don't have to react. But in the dynamic environment of law enforcement, that may not be such a practical exercise. But still, you have to be aware of what you're doing in order to make changes in training, and yet still keep in mind that to do it in the field requires an external focus.
Right. Okay. Great. So that's number 2, focus of attention. And the third one is informational properties. So what do you mean by informational properties, Tim? And how does augmented feedback related to the information that the performer receives impact their problem-solving abilities?
Yeah, information is really the traditional way of thinking about knowledge of results and knowledge performance and augmented feedback in general. Um, Information, it is what we use to make changes. You know, information, whether it's coming from an inherent source or whether it's coming from an augmented source, is that information that we use to actually affect change. So it's kind of the traditional way of thinking about augmented feedback, and this idea of motivation and attentional focus are kind of newer ideas related to the use of feedback, as well as the next one you're about to get to.
Okay, and that is feedback dependency. And I want to spend as much time as we need on this one because I think this ought to be a very significant concern for law enforcement trainers, and I say that because I have seen training environments, either firearms training, combatives training, or whatever, where I've watched officers perform. They're performing in the training environment, and then they reach a point where they have a challenge, where they experience a significant error, or that a problem they need to solve, and they'll stop. They'll actually stop performing. They won't fix the problem, and they'll look and wait for the trainer to come and give them some feedback. And I'm going, oh, if that can't happen in the real world, like it just can't happen. And so we've got to be very careful, don't we, about not creating feedback dependent learners. And so how do we understand this issue of feedback dependency, and what advice or implication do you have for trainers or coaches to think deeply about this issue?
Well, I agree with you. I think it's one of the most interesting and important issues regarding the whole concept of feedback and augmented feedback that there is. It's let's think about it from the end result. What do you want? What do you want of your trainee when they go out into the field? They want to be able to think on their own. They want to be able to problem solve on their own, and they want to be able to supplement, the situation with their own answers. They need to be able to use their inherent sources of feedback to understand the situation, because the augmented sources aren't there anymore. All those ways of providing feedback in training are now gone when you get out in the street. Okay, so how do you best prepare them for that? I think the best way to prepare them for that is to get them to use these inherent sources that they're always going to have, get them to use those inherent sources and learn how to use them in training. So by doing that, we're working backwards. So how do you get them to use their inherent sources? Well, one of the ways we talked about a few minutes ago, don't jump in with the answer so quickly. Instead, ask them, what do you think? What do you think just happened? Why did that result just occur? Tell me what you see, what you heard, what you felt, and what do those sources of information tell you what just went on? Okay? And again, going back to what we talked about before, having them think about using those sources of feedback, inherent sources of feedback, now getting them to problem solve in a way that they're going to problem solve when they're out on the street. So how do you do that? How do you minimize the importance of the augmented feedback so that they maximize the learning of their own inherent feedback? One of the ways we just talked about is to back away. Don't jump in with the answer so quickly, and ask them questions about that, get them thinking about what went on. Get them thinking about using their own vision, their own hearing, their own feeling about to try and interpret just went on. So timing, delaying the feedback is one way. Um, Relative frequency. That is, instead of uh, giving them feedback about every time they do something, just back away. Let them experience a number of situations, and before you step in and ask them what went on, get them to experience um, working without feedback, because again, when they're out in the field, they're not going to have feedback there. So get them used to not having feedback all the time. Uh, One way to do is to withdraw it slowly. That's called a faded type of feedback. Um, Another way to do it is what's called a bandwidth uh, method. And a bandwidth method is simply establishing a range of tolerance. If you say that you're training someone to do a particular still takedown technique or whatever, you establish a level of acceptability. Okay, it might be quite broad early on. Allow them to make mistakes and still say, you know what, that's okay. That's okay, and refine it, the tolerance as they gain more skill. And what that does is several things, Chris. With a wide tolerance, inside that tolerance, you're saying, okay, that's good. Outside that tolerance, you're giving them feedback about what they could correct. Okay, so inside that bandwidth, you're actually giving them positive feedback. So it's motivational, and it's also you're not giving them error information. So you're reducing feedback or error feedback in this case by setting a wide bandwidth. As they become more skilled, you can refine the tolerance level because their skill level is going to be refined as well. So you still are giving positive feedback. You're still giving reduced amount of error feedback, but in a way that is appropriate to the level of skill and a level of performance that they're working at. So that's a couple of different ways of reducing the learner's dependency on the instructor's feedback. And by reducing the dependency on the instructor's feedback, you're increasing the dependency on their own sources of inherent feedback, those sources that are always going to be available to them when they're out on the job.
Okay, so I love this concept of bandwidth feedback. I can't tell you how helpful law enforcement trainers have found that, Tim, since I first heard it from you several years ago and sought to understand it more deeply and help trainers explore this in the methods of instruction course. I think it's a model that we can grasp really easily as trainers and apply it in our learning environments. And um, one of the examples, so tolerances, I love that idea of the bandwidth and how it changes. And so if we have errors that we say, okay, I call them unallowed. There in certain things that we do, there's unallowable errors, the things that we just cannot allow a performer to do. So for example, let's say, Tim, that's in combatives where if I see one student has grabbed their partner in a certain way that I know as soon as they apply force on that, we're going to have a separated shoulder or something like that. That's outside my bandwidth. That's unallowable. So
Right.
I need to step in and provide immediate feedback on that. But if they're struggling with errors and solving problems and learning to self-organize within that bandwidth, that's all good, right? I want to allow that to continue for them to be able to learn in that environment.
Sure. Yeah, and these are things that could be refined later, um, uh, and it still allows them to problem solve the process on their own. So it's a win-win from many different respects, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'd strongly encourage trainers, as you're listening to this, is to find out more about these feedback methods and augmented feedback types and knowledge of performance versus knowledge of results. bandwidth feedback. Tim, we've been going for 1 hour. I can't believe it already. It's 1 hour on the clock. So we're going to need to wrap it up. But when is your 7th edition going to be published, and where can our listeners look to find that when it's out?
I believe that it's coming out in February of 2025, and it's published by Human Kinetics Publishers out of Champaign, Illinois. And yeah, it's called Motor Learning and Performance.
Okay, and between now and 2025, where would you encourage learners to go or trainers to go if they're hearing this and they're going, I want to find out more about how I can improve my feedback methods, and where would you direct them to?
Oh, good question. Well, there's a number of different, there are other books on the market. Richard McGill and David Anderson have an excellent book on motor learning and performance. There are various websites. I can't think of it. I can't specifically name one offhand, but that deal with motor learning performance, and certainly YouTube videos. There's a lot of great videos out there right now on learning and performance. And if you look up motor learning concepts, there's a lot of information that's available on the web for sure.
Okay, and I can maybe get some of those from you offline, and I can attach them to the show notes, any of those resources that you think might be helpful for our trainers. And Tim, if any of the listeners want to reach out to you and ask you questions about this, is that something that is acceptable? And if so, how can they get a hold of you?
Absolutely. And if you want to you have my email address. If you want to put that on your, post it on your website, I'd be happy to answer any questions that people might have.
Perfect. Great. Well, Tim, is there anything that you wished I would have asked you, or that you want to make sure that you express in our last couple minutes together?
No, I'm really impressed that I've met a number of trainers now in law enforcement, and I know that they're dealing with reduced budgets and sometimes with public discontent. And I've got all the feeling in the world for the job that you're doing and are trying to do. And I just wish you the best of luck, because you're fighting a good fight.
That is going to be extremely helpful and encouraging to our audience. It's always grateful to hear from the researchers like yourself that that you're supportive of law enforcement and the work that we do. So thank you very much. We've been talking with Dr. Tim Lee, Professor Emeritus at McMaster University's Department of Kinesiology in Hamilton, Ontario, Canada. Tim, thanks again for the time, and hope you'd like to come back on the bullpen to talk more about motor learning in the future.
Anytime, Chris. I've enjoyed it very much. Thank you.
Well, we hope that you've enjoyed this episode of the Trainer's Bullpen. And as always, our encouragement to you is that you would reflect deeply about the critical aspects of this interview and how you can apply the principles that you heard to advance your training and make your students more effective and adaptive performers in the real world. As a reminder, all of the research papers, as well as the other links, are available to you over at the Trainer's Bullpen website at trainersbullpen.com. Thank you for your dedication to advancing officer and public safety.